And today we're taking a journey into Australian history on the backs of those beasts that have come to be known as the ships of the desert, the camel. They were a part of some of the major colonial expeditions into the Australian interior, and they carried the railway sleepers and telegraph poles that connected this vast continent and eventually opened it up to the rest of the world. Australia's first camel, Harry, wasn't exactly a fine example of his species, eventually being executed for the part that he played in the death of his owner. And some would say that the trajectory of this hardy, introduced animal into our country has followed an all too familiar path, with perhaps 1 million feral camels roaming Central Australia today. For Hindsight, Matthew Crawford explores the story of the camel in Australia from various perspectives. We hear from the writers, Peter McGuinness and Pamela Rakowski, from a chef in Alice Springs who's been serving up camel for 20 years, and we walk the Simpson Desert with the camels of Andrew Harper and his team from Australian Desert Expeditions. Here then is Ships of the Desert.
At first, they are queer, awkward, slow, hard to understand, stupid, smelly, unapproachable and unfriendly, horribly noisy with awful groans at loading time, generally repulsive and trying to the nerves of anyone in a hurry. The whole process of travelling by camel seems antiquated and exasperating. But when the thermometer begins to pass 100 degrees day after day, when the feed disappears and only dry brambles can be found, and finally, when water and the possibility of water become nothing but a wild hope, then the camel comes into his own. There he kneels, uncomplaining and unconcerned, a tower of strength and comfort, living on the fat of his hump, and good for another 200 miles.
In Central Australia, for a few shillings a week, you can hire a camel, his shadow by day and his warmth by night, a peg in his nose and a pack on his back, to carry you over the rim of beyond, and on the way he'll feed himself and never ask for water. Should you be an appraiser of true worth, valuing not appearances, but the unfailing fidelity of every day, the patient cooperation of years, for £5 you can buy him outright.
The camels travelled over the stones with their loads, apparently quite unconcerned. They are undoubtedly the best of all animals for this kind of work. They eat anything nearby, from the gum tree to the smallest herb, then come and lie down beside you, whereas horses and bullocks, if there be any lack of food, will ramble all over the country.
Their ability to go without water has nothing to do with their humps, which are in fact for storing fat. But they can vary their temperature 10 degrees, so have little need to sweat. Their blood is so constructed as to allow for enormous dehydration and thickening, and they can tank up with massive quantities of water without going into shock. They can cover their eyes with a thin membrane to protect against sandstorms, and they can close down their noses to filter out dust. But their feet are undoubtedly the most curious part of them. Round, flat plates, like ball tyres with a squishy bladder inside, and 2 large toenails in front. They can lope vast distances on these silly padded feet, quiet as shadows on the sand.
The South Australian Register, 19th of February 1845. When Mr. Phillips in the Apolline touched at Tenerife 5 years ago on his voyage from London, he shipped 4 male and female camels, 3 of which, unfortunately, died from injuries received during a storm immediately after the vessel put to sea. The disconsolate survivor is now at a station in South Australia's north, his feats limited to the scaring of astonished horses, who jump and fly at his approach, and to the occasional variety of frightening a benighted traveller out of his wits. But it is a pity camels should be here so scarce as to be objects of wonder and alarm. Their strength, docility, and long endurance of drought would render them most useful to us, and they may be bought at Tenerife for a trifle.
I'm Peter McInnes. I'm the author of 2 books about Australian exploration. The first one is Australia's Pioneers, Heroes and Fools, and also for the National Library of Australia, Australian Backyard Explorer. If you're trying to work with camels, you have to know how to handle them. In the early days, people didn't have much idea about this, and so their idea of relating to a camel was to give it a name. So John Ainsworth Horrocks, who was very much a gentleman, with linen napkin always on the keg that he ate his dinner off and silver service, John Horrocks called his camel Harry. Harry was at that stage the only camel in Australia. Horrocks didn't know much about camels, and that was his problem.
The South Australian Register, 15th of July, 1846. The expedition, under the command of Mr. Horrocks, started from Adelaide on Saturday morning last. The object is to explore the hitherto unknown country northwest of the ranges of Mount Arden. The public has evinced a proper appreciation of the object by subscribing towards the outfit a sum above £140. Mr. Horrocks has taken with him rations for 5 months, and is accompanied by a party of 5 other travellers. And last, not least, the camel, not par excellence, being the only one in the colony. It is with the greatest regret I have to inform the committee and my fellow colonists who subscribed to the expedition of its untimely and unfortunate termination. On the 5th day, Kilroy, who was walking ahead of the party, stopped, saying he saw a beautiful bird, which he recommended me to shoot to add to the collection. My gun being loaded with slugs in one barrel and ball in the other, I stopped the camel to get at the shot belt. Whilst Mr. Gill was unfastening it, I was screwing the ramrod into the wad over the slugs, standing close alongside of the camel. At this moment, the camel gave a lurch to one side and caught his pack on the lock of my gun, which discharged the barrel I was unloading, the contents of which first took off the middle finger of my right hand between the second and third joints, and entered my left cheek by my lower jaw, knocking out a row of teeth from my upper jaw.
The watercolour artist S.T. Gill was there with Horrocks, so when Horrocks was wounded, it was Gill who stepped to the front. He grabbed a handkerchief and he wrapped it around the stump or stumps of the fingers, and unfortunately it wasn't the cleanest of handkerchiefs, it would seem, because over a period of a month, Horrocks very slowly died of gangrene. But not before he had made some plans for the disposition, shall we say, of Harry. Now, Horrocks believed that in spite of Harry's manifest failings, his tendency to bite bags of flour and spill the flour on the ground, his tendency to bite the cook garlic on the head, to pick up a goat and try and break its back, in spite of all of those things, he felt that camels had a future in Australia. He felt, however, that Harry was not a good specimen of his species, and therefore it would be better for all concerned if Harry were to be disposed of. So Harry was taken outside to be shot. Now, Harry was a tough old camel, and while Jimmy Morehouse was holding him, the bullet was put into his head, and Harry refused to die. Somewhat miffed by the wound, he turned around and bit Jimmy Morehouse on the head. Perhaps Jimmy let go at that stage, but nonetheless they got Harry under control again. They reloaded, they shot him a second time, and this time he did in fact die. I always think it's a pity. If Harry had bitten the man with the gun instead, perhaps these days, instead of saying as game as Ned Kelly, we'd be saying as game as Harry the Camel, which would have been far more appropriate in a lot of ways.
I'm Pamela Rakowski, and in the 1980s I travelled Australia researching the book In the Tracks of the Camel Men, which is my history of the Afghan Cameleers and camels in Australia. The first Afghan Cameleers in Australia were 3 Afghans who came over in 1860 to manage the camels that were hired for the Burke and Wills expedition.
There was obviously a plan for the Victorian Exploring Expedition, as it was then called, to have camels quite early on, because John Wills, in a letter to his mother in 1859, wrote of trying a camel and said that they were far from unpleasant to ride. I suspect that probably Wills had a much more sturdy posterior that was used to sitting in saddles than I had, so he wasn't getting saddle sores from it, or perhaps he had a better saddle, I don't know. But nonetheless, he found them pleasant to ride. The problem was that the camels also had a lack of understanding about them.
A man who answered their advertisements for someone who could handle camels was a man called George Landors, who actually had lived in Kandahar for some time and had witnessed the British Army using camels to carry loads. So he shared that expertise with the Burke and Wills expedition. The first 3 cameleers were hired by Landors, who actually went back to Kandahar to collect the camels for the Victorian government.
It was almost accepted as a racial characteristic of anyone from the subcontinent that they would understand camels and be able to drive them. The people who came were generally referred to as Indians in those days because Pakistan hadn't been invented. Borders were very fluid and ill-defined, and people would be referred to as Indians or sepoys or Hindus, but the name Afghan is the one that seems to have come down to us today.
And in the diaries written by Burke and Wills, they talk a lot about how the camels sometimes got a bit out of hand and had to be fetched every morning, and didn't write so much about the Afghan cameleers, but certainly it was the Afghan cameleers who taught the members of the Burke and Wills expedition how to find water with the camels, how to treat the camels, how to load them correctly every day, because they needed to be loaded in a certain way, otherwise the camels would not cooperate.
Landors knew about camels, but Burke kept on overriding him, so in the end Landors had a fit of pique and headed off on his own, and that left Wills to become the 2IC. And Wills didn't have all that much knowledge about camels either. Of course, some of Landors' ideas were a bit strange. He had rum along which was going to cure the camels of scurvy. In the end, there was trouble over the rum, and Burke insisted on getting rid of it, and that was the reason that Landors finally left. It was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. And that's where the whole expedition probably was doomed. It was just a disaster from woe to go. Burke was entirely unfitted to lead an expedition. Wills certainly had some scientific insights. Landors had the ability to manage the camels, but they probably needed Landors and Wills, and they didn't really need Burke, but they had him. I think after the Burke and Wills expedition, everyone agreed that camels were an essential item. When the camels did get them right across to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and they got them most of the way back, under the proper circumstances, the camels would have got them all the way back to Melbourne in triumph. But things just didn't pan out quite the way they should. But it wasn't the fault of the camels. The camels had worked perfectly, they were ideal for the job, and people were going to use them again.
The South Australian Advertiser, 9th of January 1866. The Blackwall was dispatched some time ago to Karachi by the Honourable Thomas Elder for the purpose of bringing down a cargo of camels. It has now returned to Port Augusta, with 120 camels on board. We feel justified in giving this information a prominent position, as the experiment of introducing camels into the far north is a subject of very great importance to the interests of the squatters in that district, and of the colony generally.
Thomas Elder had come to South Australia with the intention of setting up a huge enterprise and opening up pastoralism in South Australia because pastoral leases were quite cheap. He was able to involve his own partner, Samuel Stuckey, in communicating with a veteran of the Burke and Wills expedition, who was George Landors, who was very familiar with the camels. Landors was able to advise Samuel Stuckey and therefore Thomas Elder on which were the best camels to import to Australia should they venture into commercial enterprise. So it was Thomas Elder who paid for Samuel Stuckey to go over to India in 1865. Samuel Stuckey collected 121 camels and 31 Afghan handlers, the word Afghan being used quite loosely, put them on a ship, the SS Blackwell, and then they were shipped into Port Augusta, where Thomas Elder met them at the port, and then the camels and the Afghans were taken up to Beltana. Thomas Elder's plan was that he would start his own camel stud from any baby camels that were born once they'd arrived here. And at the same time, he would start an enterprise that would mean supporting a lot of pastoral landowners to cope with droughts, get their wool off their stations and down to Port Augusta, where that wool could then be exported to London. At the same time, Thomas Elder heard that the South Australian government was setting up an overland telegraph line and needed a contractor to provide transport for the large poles and the wires that would be needed to be established between Port Augusta and Alice Springs. Thomas Elder, therefore, was able to use his camels further in setting up internal communication that would link Australia to London. There was an amazing number of camels being imported between the 1860s and the 1880s, and then it's only Thomas Elder, I believe, that really attempted to set up a camel start of his own. And from that camel start, he actually used his own camels, which were reputed to be of a much better quality than the camels that were being imported.
The Argus, 29th of December 1875. The progress of geographical exploration in the interior of this continent continues to fill up some of the blanks on the map, and to confirm the prevalent belief with respect to the arid character of the Central Plains and mountain ranges. In May last, the Honourable Thomas Elder of South Australia equipped a party under the leadership of Mr. Ernest Giles, consisting of 8 persons and 22 camels, to explore the country stretching between the western confines of that colony and Western Australia.
Ernest Giles is probably the most unfortunate of all of the explorers because he was never rewarded for his work, he never got proper fame or recognition, and yet what he did was, in a negative sense, highly important. He established that while you could get across to Western Australia, going through the middle of Australia, there was very little reason why you'd want to. It was sort of negative knowledge in a sense.
On one occasion, the party plodded wearily over an utterly dry and desolate expanse of desert for 16 days, without finding the slightest trace of water. During the last month of their arduous journey, their provisions having been exhausted, the members of the expedition subsisted on the eggs of the mallee hen. The labours of the expedition have conclusively shown that the 2 colonies are separated by a broad band of territory of unqualified barrenness.
When you look at someone like Giles, by the 1870s he had already realised that there were expeditions going out with camels, and he just didn't see how he could possibly compete. He said,
"Oh, would that I had camels! What are horses in such a region and such a heated temperature as this? The animals are not physically capable of enduring the terrors of this country. I was now scarcely 100 miles from the camp, and the horses had plenty of water up to nearly halfway, but now they looked utterly unable to return."
He was desperate to get camels, and luckily for him he knew Baron Ferdinand von Müller, a scientific gentleman from Melbourne, and Baron von Müller was able to introduce him to Thomas Elder. So as a result, he was able to get some camels, and he was suddenly able to do marvellous things. And in 1876 he said,
"To a man accustomed to camels for exploration, the beautiful horse sinks into the insignificance of a pygmy when compared to his majestic rival, the mighty ship of the desert."
And then he said later on, in 1889, looking back, he'd then been through it, and by then camels were widely used across Australia.
My first and second expeditions were conducted entirely with horses. In all my after journeys, I had the services of camels, without whose aid the travels and adventures which are subsequently recorded could not possibly have been achieved. Nor should I now be alive, as Byron says, to write so poor a tale, this lowly lay of mine.
He knew what the camels had done for him. They had got him through twice, they had kept him alive, and nothing else would have done it.
Most of the Afghans had left their own country as experienced camel men, members of a long-established profession, a father-to-son dynasty. They stuck persistently to camels while here, and it was a good thing for this country that they did so. A tough, capable and enterprising lot of men that had pioneered so much of Australia.
The word Afghan is actually a loose term used to incorporate anyone that came in through immigration that was wearing a turban and bloomers. Back in the 1860s, when Afghan Camels started to arrive in Australia in significant numbers, in those days, immigration authorities didn't really ask them to specify which particular region of India or Asia they came from. So what was a group of Afghan Camels actually were men who came from Baluchistan, which is now part of Pakistan. Some actually came from the interior of Afghanistan, because many traders from Afghanistan actually came into India, which was part of the British Empire then.
You know, the walls of Zany Khan's cottage in Maree are adorned with pictures of camels and Afghan camel drivers, such as the picture of the first camel being unloaded at Port Augusta last century. Camels have always been part of her life. Her father was an Afghan camel driver from Karachi, and Maree, where she was born 76 years ago, was known as the Ghan town. Actually, Maree in those days was two towns, the European town and on the other side of the railway track, the Afghan town.
When we were children, we more or less lived with them. You know, used to go out and shepherd them when we did go to school. And then my dad used to load them up and carry load from here to Birdsville. All the stores, you know, there's no cars those days. No, all our lives we've been really with camels until, you know, after I was married and the camels disappeared. Then I married an Afghan chap, and he was a camel driver when he was 9 years old, Norm was. But they had a very hard life, you know, those boys those days. When 9-year-old, they'd start going up the Birdsville track. And sometimes they'd get a shirt and a trousers for their wages.
Mr. Dean Dudler of Maree is one of the few surviving camel drivers. The son of an Afghan driver, he started working with his father's team when only 14 years of age.
What was it like travelling up and down the Birdsville in those days?
Oh, it was very bad, hard living. See, them fellas, they wouldn't eat meat that anyone else killed for them. They had to kill it themselves, and made it hard. All you could do was pull up at these stations and get a goat now and again. You see, of course, when they killed it, you could eat it.
Now, when you say those fellas, to whom are you
the father
referring?
And all the rest of the old camel drivers. The Mohammedans, they were, see.
The Afghan Cameliers were quite a spiritual people also. When they came here to this country, they were contracted to work, but they did bring all their own customs and beliefs with them. They were able to set up their own Ghan towns where their families with either European women or Aboriginal women and the children all living together. The Afghans came mainly from Mohammedan groups. A few of them were Sikh, but in the outback they practiced the Mohammedan religion. They did set up a mosque in Maree. There was a small hut used in Farina as a praying centre. They set up a mosque in Perth eventually. The mosques in Adelaide and Perth are solid buildings that which still exist today, and there are records of all the different Afghans who contributed their own money to the building of these mosques back in the 1890s.
Now, you're saying when you were a child that you were brought up as a strict Mohammed. What was the feeling between the communities? I mean, there would have been an Aboriginal community, Afghans, and a white community. What was...
This was the Afghan side, and like the English people, like we weren't accepted.
You mean the side? You mean side of the railway line?
Where the railway is.
Yeah.
This was the Ghan town, they used to call it. And they'd tease us. We went through a lot through being an Afghan, of course, in those days. We weren't allowed to go in a hall or mix with the white people. Any dances or anything, we weren't allowed to go. Although the Afghans were very strict with us too. They sort of didn't like us mixing very much either. With the white people.
Now, where did you used to load these camels?
In the yard here. They used to bring the loading from over the railway station with a horse and cart, you see. Put it there because we had to judge the weights. You had to have the even weight on both sides. You couldn't have one side, everything you had to even the weight from, you see.
How long would it take you to get to Birdsville from Maree?
Well, sometimes we used to do it in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and sometimes about 18 days. You couldn't do much under 16, though.
Why the difference in time?
Well, sometimes you had to do it. You see, if they wanted these rations, they'll run out of short of things and they wanted them at certain times, see? Otherwise they'd no beer or they'd starve them for something. You had to press them along a bit.
Well, in a normal day, how far would you travel?
Well, sometimes 25, 20. Take you all day, though. They do about 4 miles an hour.
How many camels in a normal train?
Oh, we had 50. Oh, we had 50 to 60. Some of them had 70. Oh, yeah.
And how many men would it take to look after a train of that size?
Well, we barely about 4 of us. 4, yeah.
Well, this would mean that every morning you'd have to load up the camels, and every night unload them again, and this would continue until such time as you got from here to Birdsville, and if it's taking 16 to 21 days, that's a lot of hard work.
Oh, terrible hard work. That's what we used to do. That had to be done, night and day, morning and night.
What sort of pay did you get?
Pay? Never got any. For the old though. We used to go to Birdsville back home, we get about, we call it $2 these days, £1 or something. Might be 30 bob or $3. That's all we get pocket money. All the rest would go for food, see?
About how many camel trains were here in Marie at that time?
Oh, about 20. Oh, a lot of them, yeah, about 20.
Well, about how many camels would that mean?
Altogether, oh, there's hundreds there. They used to shoot them out in the paddocks here to keep them down, too many of them.
Tarcoola, 1904. The place is overrun with Afghans and camels. The camels are eating up all the bush for miles around the field. The camels are not only destroying our pasture, but they are a menace to human life. Lots of our horses will not get reconciled to them. It is practicable for the Afghans to deliver their loading and then keep their camels outside of the town. At the present time, they have run all the teams off the road, and they are becoming a curse to the field.
Mojo toolboxes.
Yeah, why not?
He can.
Weight, yeah.
He thinks he can't, but he can.
Yeah. Oh, he's strong. Yeah.
Yep.
So we've got 2 sets of those, aren't we?
Yep. Because then Ed's takes the other lot.
2. Yeah, that'll work well.
Choose cot bags is great because she doesn't mind people around her. You know, working around her.
A bit better.
Yeah. Her form. God, you're so nice. Chewy's our fattest cow.
She's not a fat cow.
She's voluptuous.
You can get a camel to work with you and for you through the wrong methods. Whereas we like to have an arrangement where they work for you because they want to. You know, it's the same principle as working with a sheepdog or a cattle dog or a horse. And sure, you know, you could be very vocal and aggressive and they would still do it, but it wouldn't be much fun. It'd be unpleasant, you know. And all of these camels, like any working animal, you know, they eventually, you know, they will respect you if they're treated well. And they will do as you ask. Because you think about it, some of these animals weigh 3/4 of a ton. If they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't.
The Afghans were reputed to be fairly tough on their camels. I mean, they only had four men to about 70 camels. And they had to be loaded every morning, so they didn't want their camels stepping out of the line. I mean, those 70 camels were probably carrying about 20 tons. It'd be a hell of a job.
Camels and the Outback. Herbert M. Barker. About the year 1923, I was carting asbestos from near Nullagine to Marble Bar, about 70 miles. I had been carting 9-ton loads for about 3 months. when on the road one day I saw the camels turning their heads to look behind them. Little used to escape their notice, and this time it turned out to be the most formidable creature of all time, a motor lorry. The driver had a load of asbestos on, but I thought there was little danger of him competing with camels. But before I got to Marble Bar, he had done 3 trips, and the mine manager sent word to me not to come back for more. It gave us an awful shock. After being accustomed to taking 2 weeks for the round trip, we could not believe that it could be done with a motor in one day. Towards the end of 1927, the last of the active Afghan camel men left the Marble Bar district, taking their camels with them. 4 of them went, with Nak Muhammad as their leader. 2 others, who were too old, were left behind, Shir Muhammad and Zareen. But as Nak planned to cut off 40 or 50 unwanted camels at the first sheep fence that was reached, Shir set out with them to go as far as the fence. After about 30 miles, they came across a suitable place. I happened to ride up just after Shir Muhammad had put his camels over the ridge. He was standing there watching them disappear in the distance, never to be mustered again. "I say goodbye, my Camel," he said. I didn't speak. He seemed so deep in thought, I felt it best to wait till he got things straightened out. Finally he turned and said, 50 years I stay in this country, work all the time. Now I finish." He took one more look. There were only 1 or 2 camels still in sight, and they soon vanished. What would Shir Muhammad do now? There was no job for him that I could think of. Those Afghans kept so religiously to the camel traffic that they learned to do no other sort of work. That was their tragedy. Afghans and camels were unwanted in the automobile age.
What's that right? What's that right? What's that right? That's the way.
According to Senior Conservation Officer with Parks and Wildlife Glenn Edwards, camels have become both a resource and a pest.
The animals are encroaching more and more onto pastoral properties and onto national parks, and in doing so they actually cause noticeable damage. Camels damage fences on pastoral properties and also around national parks. They're big animals, they go straight through fences. But also we know that camels are quite selective eaters or foragers, and they do concentrate on some rare native plants, and that's a big conservation issue for us.
Central Australia is just such a huge country, plenty of food, generally plenty of moisture in the food if there's no lack of surface water, so they just love the country. And from an early start about 90 years ago when they were released from Broken Hill and certainly Alice Springs when the railheads came into being and they were just released and just left to roam running wild, they certainly know how to regenerate. We talk about how good rabbits are. Camels must be right up there.
Well, undoubtedly it's a big problem and something has to be done about it. But it would be a tremendous waste of a resource just to sit in a helicopter and shoot them. And I agree that the population has to be reduced. However, with my travels around the various deserts of Australia over the last 16 years, I'm not saying that the wild camel population doesn't do, hasn't made an impact, but if you look at the impact of feral cats and foxes and rabbits and donkeys and pigs and goats and horses, that is enormous, and particularly cats on the bird and lizard population and diversity in the country is, well, we don't really know, the damage there. I mean, we see cat tracks right across the desert. Every trip I've done, I've seen cat tracks in the most remote places. Sure, camels are big, they leave a pad print, they do eat, but as far as their impact on the biodiversity of the native animal population, we really should be looking at cats and foxes and rabbits first in association with camels. Camels are just one other feral animal that we've managed to bugger up the system with here.
My name's Noel Fullerton. I went to the Territory back in the early 60s. My main life in the Northern Territory was mixed up with camels. When I first went to Alice Springs, they had two Lions clubs up there. I was part of the Alice Springs Lion Club to start with, but our club wanted something for the bicentenary coming up, and I suggested a camel race. And I challenged a gentleman called Keith Murney Smith to a race, and I turned up with the camels and he chickened out. And the Lions Club from then on thought it would be a good money raiser, so we had a race down the Todd River, and Mr. Kurt Purcell won it. He put a young camel at the finish line and rode its mother down the creek, which was there was no rules and regulations, it was quite good.
It's not yet the race that stops the nation, but galloping the Camel Cup came close to stopping jockeys' hearts.
It's kind of like being strapped by bungee cords to a folding chair, and it's just going up and down.
It's unreal. It's unbelievable. I think as we get older, we get crazier. Insanity is a great help of galloping a camel at 35 k's an hour.
The Camel Cup, I think, started a lot of interest in camels, and a lot of other people started to get them, and a lot of them were very disappointed because they couldn't win the races up there, because we used to cheat. We'd put 12 in to win with and 12 to get in road of the opposition, but it was good for the town. We used to involve a lot of coloured people into the races. Most of my jockeys were part Aboriginal. I used it as a people mixer. And it's like sport as a people mixer in the Northern Territory now. Football mixes people, and it changed a lot of attitudes, because it was very important to me that this happened, because I have a lot of Aboriginal relations. One of my sons married an Aboriginal girl, one married an Afghan girl, and I've got Aboriginal grandchildren and Afghan grandchildren, and mixing of people was very important to me. And as far as I'm concerned, it was the camels that started the mixing for me up there.
Lady, I've been here since within the restaurant since about 1988, so I've had a fairly big fist of it over 20 years, but I've been a fearless consumer here since late 1975 when I relocated down from Darwin, and the camel industry at that stage up until the mid-80s was virtually non-existent, but at that time there was a growing concern about the pest value, if you like, of the wild camels, and a lot of the pastoralists got together then, and with the support of the Northern Territory government at that particular point in time, set up an industry steering committee, which sadly their funding was cut some years ago, but at that stage they really set about trying to find ways and means of, I guess, culling camels but value-adding the product. Things like, obviously, the hide, the meat, naturally, the camel hides, the fat content, so making things like soaps, etc., etc. They did a great job, but it was premature that the funding was cut at the time, sadly, but because they never received critical mass.
They tried all angles and everything to do to make the camel a viable proposition for people in Australia. And it's just a pity that we couldn't get the abattoirs to kill for export overseas. But if we could have got it in those days, it would have been a thriving industry today.
We've had camel meat on our menus now for probably 18, 20 years, and I've had a lot of fun experimenting with it. A lot of fun taking Jurassic lamb shanks or roast leg of camel around Australia. And but look, on a serious note, camel meat is a very, very healthy meat. It has the lowest fat and cholesterol levels of any red meat available for human consumption, certainly in Australia. And subject to availability, we sell quite a bit at the steakhouse level, and we generally have camel sausages, camel filet mignons, and just camel steaks, which are popular for those who dare to try something different, and obviously taking a healthy perspective on their diet.
Steady, camel. Steady. Steady, Colson. Steady.
Well, commercial treks were actually begun by the founder of the Outback Camel Company, Rex Ellis, in '76, when he led and organised the first commercial camel expedition in Australia, and that was across the Simpson Desert from west to east. And more or less that was the first time that camels had been used in that way since the Afghans had stopped using them for commercial business in the 20s and early 30s. These camels today have their history from 34 years ago. The second age of camel transport began, I guess, in Australia. I mean, there's always been various places where you can do a camel ride, on the beach in Broome or somewhere like that. And that's good, but it's a totally different ballgame to this. These camels are working hard in the traditional sense that they were originally brought out here 150 years ago, their ancestors, when they came out here. So what we're doing today has a very strong lineage stretching back 150 years.
Andrew Harper leading his string of camels into the Simpson Desert for another season of camel treks. In Ships of the Desert, we also heard from Andrew Harper's fellow cameleers, Ingrid and Wilco, from the chef Wayne Craft in Alice Springs, from Noel Fullerton, who founded the Alice Springs Camel Cup, and from the authors Peter McInnes and Pamela Rakowski. Readings were by Humphrey Bauer, and the producer was Matthew Crawford.